Uhuru comrades, welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday Study featuring Chairman Omali Yeshitela. My name is Akile Anai. I'm the Director of Agitation and Propaganda for the African People's Socialist Party, as well as your MC for this morning. These studies are so important, and we encourage you right now to invite your friends and family to it. And this week, Chairman Omali Yeshitela opens up part one of a three-part discussion on the Theory of African Internationalism, reading from Vanguard, the Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, Chapter 9, starting on page 273. For the first hour, Chairman will review the study materials, and in the second hour, we'll open it up for you, our live viewers, to ask questions. It's my honor now to introduce our leadership, the leader of the African nation and the worldwide African Revolution, our Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Uhuru, Chairman.
I want to welcome all of the participants in this study and just reinforce the basis of our doing this study every Sunday and finding other occasions to engage in political education as well. There's some people who I suspect may be really impatient with doing political education, dealing with issues of theory and philosophy, especially at a time like this, where there's so much social and political turbulence affecting the entire world, and much of it, is centered in the U.S., which is which is right now the shaky leader of the world capitalist system. But it is important. It is because the struggle we're involved in as a people has to be able to identify in a very fundamental way the source of the contradiction that we're confronted with, the basis of the problem, the genesis of it, where it comes from, how we happen to be in this situation. It needs to be able to do that as clearly as possible. And we also need to be able to say, this is where we are going. And here is the reason we are trying to get there and how it is that we have to achieve these aims. We have to be able, with as much clarity as possible, especially during a period of such turbulence that we live in today. The fact is that right now we talk about an uneasy equilibrium, that the existing social order is teetering, and there are various forces who are contending to be able to capture the leadership of the world, to either maintain the existing social system, or well, certainly most of them are not involved in trying to overturn the social system as much as they are involved in making a contest within the social system to see who's going to be a dominating force. And sometimes that's domestically. When I say domestically, I mean within the particular countries that are affected. And sometimes there's enough consciousness for it to be a contest that's being made between different countries for hegemony, world hegemony. And a problem, of course, occurs when the African people upon whose back, and the colonized people upon whose back the entire social system rests. The problem is that when we are not active participants with our own understanding of where the hell it is we have to go, how we happen to be here, and the reality that the entire system rests upon our oppression and exploitation. So we can be passive onlookers in this process while the contending forces battle it out, most often using us as proxies to fight for them, because the world situation today is extremely dangerous, and the major powers do not look forward to having to go directly head to head with each other, because it could mean the extermination of everybody on the planet, nuclear weapons unleashed and things like that. So in order to avoid this direct head-to-head contest with each other, what happens is that they use their influence to mobilize Africans and Mexicans and other oppressed peoples around the world to do their biddings for them. Even if we are not aware we are doing their biddings, and the greatest likelihood that we will do their bidding for them is when we are uninformed and our actions are not tethered to, connected to some scientific explanation of the world that has resulted in the development of a philosophy of our own. And that's why we would talk about philosophy. It's extremely important. Now, having said that, I also want to make it clear that there is a tremendous amount of turbulence. The existing social system now is shaky as hell. And not only does it mean that countries like China and the US and China and Russia and the US and various other forces, and sometimes forces who used to be friends or who pretend to be friends in exacerbated contention with each other. But it also means within some of these countries, in particular in the United States, we see now how these contradictions are resulting in more and more of extreme, what is often characterized as extreme and armed behavior by different players. I understand that just last night, or there was one or two people killed in Portland, Oregon, where I understand that hundreds of Trump supporters came out firing different kinds of weapons, I think some paint guns and other things, and shooting occurred. And I don't know the details of it, but that's not even the most important thing. The thing is that these confrontations, these clashes between these forces are happening more and more. In various parts of the country, there are different militia, white militia groups that used to be considered to be extreme outliers in the debate, increasingly involving people who are in political office and people who are planning to be in political office as normal, quote unquote, housewives and things like that. And people are arming themselves, and they are arming themselves, recognizing the immigrants and the Africans, and who, from their perspective, immigrants too, outsiders. They are arming themselves to contend and deal with us. So as this crisis deepens economically, as the obvious ascendancy of the obvious ascent of white people has been halted and is even being pushed back, there's a even veiled hysteria that you can see occurring within the white world, and certainly within the United States, growing suicides and things like that, people, drug addiction, alcoholism, and are simply symptoms of this, this thing that's happening with white people who have for so long being the subjects of history, now see themselves defined by the rest of the world and being defined by actually what's happening in the world, losing what they've assumed to be their rightful place at the heights of civilization and success. So this is resulting in white people acting out in various ways and organizing themselves, as I mentioned, in militias who are showing up more and more to demonstration, mobilizations, and sometimes engaging in shooting, as we saw not too long ago in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and this is to be obvious. This is going to be seen. This is going to be seen more and more. And I just want to say to you, to Africans and those of you who presuppose a friendship with African people, that it would make sense for you to arm yourselves and to organize our communities and what have you to be capable of self-defense. In this instance, self-defense, that is to say that we have a responsibility not to die just as hapless people who are followers of these forces who would lead us into the swamps, assuming that our future lies with America. America has no future, and that's one of the things that's driving so many of the white people crazy. Just the other day, there was a massive mobilization in Washington, D.C. where thousands, literally thousands of people participated in a Democratic Party sponsored Get Out the Vote campaign in the name of civil rights and in the name of responding to what happened to George Floyd and what happened to people like Brother Blake, who was just killed in Kenosha. Every instrument of the liberal bourgeoisie supported that and pushed for it and helped to make sure that people around the country and around the world saw it. They dragged out the family members of victims of police violence who dutifully stood up and said that we can't fight violence with violence, and who stood up dutifully even after their own family members had been murdered, to tell African people that you can't respond to the violence of our aggressors with defense of yourself, violent defense of yourselves. And of course, with the resounding theme and message of the entire thing is vote, vote, vote. And they would put this as an issue between the Republican Party and the African people, or Trump and the African people and the rest of us, when the fact is that the Democratic and Republican Party elections campaign for president, the two political conventions of the Democratic Party, the one of the Democratic Party and the other of the Republican Party, these represent contests between the ruling class. These are contests between the ruling class, but then the struggle between the ruling class, generally speaking, is a non-violent struggle. But they thrust us, the people, into combat in their interests. And so when you see these thousands of people go out in Washington, D.C., getting out the vote, which is effectively what it is, only thing that Al Sharpton could ever think about doing when he's not, anyway, the only thing Sharpton could think about doing when he's out talking about getting out the vote. This is a way to contain the resistance, contain the struggle of African people that's exploding all around this country within the safe embrace of the Democratic Party or the electoral process itself. That's what we're looking at. And so we do this because we have this study and these studies, and to provide the political education, because it's absolutely necessary for us to arm the masses of African working people and people, militants and people who have considered how to overturn our oppression, to arm us, to take the political education to the masses of our people. There is an assumption among some elitists, many of whom call themselves leftists and communists and nationalists, et cetera, that philosophy is something that cannot be understood or embraced by masses of the working people. And we say that it's only in the hands of the working people that it will make a difference. And that's why the African People's Socialist Party, which is its Advanced Detachment, which is the vanguard of the African working class and the African nation, does so much to try to provide political education for masses of people, because we have to overturn this relationship. And it has to be something more than just some empty slogan, just some hustler's chant. It has to be more than that. It has to have a scientific basis and foundation. And that's what it is that we try to provide the people. There are opportunists who call themselves leftists and revolutionaries and sometimes communists and what have you, and sometimes pseudo-nationalists. Who are also condemning the Democrats and Republican Party, but they do so in a fashion that makes an assumption that it is really these political parties, the so-called duopoly, that is the real concern that we have, and it makes it difficult to understand that what we're contending with is a social system that has two faces. A quarter is a quarter, a nickel is a nickel, a dime is a dime when you look at US currency. And on one side, there is one look, on the other side, there's another look, but it's the same nickel, it's the same quarter, it's the same penny, if you will. And that's what we look at when we look at the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. There's just two different sides of the same coin. The value is the same. It doesn't matter which side you're looking at. And neither of these has our interests at heart. And the only way we're going to have a future is to be able to understand, define our own interests, to understand the basis for our conditions of existence as Black people around the world, and what relationship does our oppression here in the United States have with the oppression of African people elsewhere. So we want to talk about philosophy. And it's a philosophy that's based on a scientific examination of human society. That's what Garvey talked about when the book Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey was put forward. It was distinguished the Garvey movement from everything else that existed at the time. And you saw contending political forces fighting with Garvey, some of them working to put Garvey in prison, some of them who have become renowned and well-known and appreciated by people who call themselves leftists today, who were empty, and they could not successfully contend with Garvey when it came between the message that Garvey took to the masses of the people and their message. And therefore, what they ended up doing was employing in their service the United States government and various other imperialist forces around the world that helped to crush the Garvey movement. They helped to do physically through violence of the colonial state what they could not do in a contest of ideas with the Garvey movement. Here, we want the African masses to be able to participate in this contest of ideas, and that's why we go through this study, and I've spent too much time overviewing it. But as Comrade Keeley has just said, we're looking at the theory of African internationalism. This is chapter 9 in the book Vanguard, the political report to the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. The fact is that this was first printed in Uneasy Equilibrium, which was the political report to the 6th Congress. But we felt it significant enough that this study, and the chapter that dealt with the question of the nation, we felt them significant enough to include them in this study, in this work, Vanguard, in the political report to the 7th Congress as well. So that's what we want to look at. And I'm using Vanguard as the basis because I want you to buy Vanguard. I want you to study this. I want you to be able to grapple with these ideas. And so anyway, I'm on page, this is chapter 9. This is page 273. I'm going to be expeditious because I do want us to have time to just talk. And I want to allow enough time for that, which means I'll be reading rather quickly. And I want you to deal with this. I want you to investigate this. I want you to study this entire chapter. It's extremely important. This battle of ideas is the ideas that should be informing what it is that we're doing and where it is that we have to go. So this is chapter 10 in Vanguard, the theory of African internationalism. The science of African internationalism enabled our party to avoid the ideological pitfalls that validate the assumption of the superiority of white people. Thus, we have never been diverted from our mission of capturing power and uniting Africa and our nation under the leadership of the African working class. Our party brought science to our defeated African liberation movement at a time when it was generally bogged down in racial and cultural nationalism that indulged in candlelit ceremonies, religious obscurantism, and nostalgia for an often imaginary African past. Through African internationalism, we were able to discover the material basis for the exploitation and oppression of Africans and others in this world. Through African internationalism, we were able to discover the material basis for the exploitation and oppression of Africans and others in the world. With African internationalism, we can understand the material forces at work in the movement of history. We can clearly see the current shift in the balance of power between the oppressor and the oppressed, between Europe and the rest of us, between the so-called white man and the so-called black man. We determined long ago that characterizing our movement as a struggle against racism was a self-defeating waste of time. What is called racism is simply the ideological foundation of capitalist imperialism. Recently, racism, rather, is a concept that denies Africans our national identity and dignity, rather than defining the system of our oppression. It relegates us to the Sisyphean task of winning acceptance from and often becoming one with our oppressors. With African internationalism, we have proven that race is simply a colonial invention originating from the enslavement and colonization of Africans and Africa that gave birth to capitalism and simultaneously the European nation. Our struggle has always been for power, not against racism. To the extent that we win power, the so-called racism of others become irrelevant. Power is the great equalizer, the fundamental aphrodisiac that is capable of turning a racist of today into a fawning sycophant of tomorrow. The struggle against racism is the struggle of the petty bourgeoisie fighting to integrate into the white capitalist world to board the sinking ship of white power. It is a diversionary struggle reliant on failed philosophical assumptions that must be cast aside as a precondition for moving forward. This is not an innocent issue of semantics. The way this is understood informs our practice. The struggle against racism presupposes one approach, and the struggle against imperialism, imperialist colonialism, another. Africans are not a race, but a nation of people forcibly dispersed across the globe. We have been pushed out of history by our imperialist oppressors, partially through the concept of race. Our national homeland has been occupied in various ways for millennia. Our people have been captured and shipped around the world as capitalist commodities. Our labor and land have been violently extracted to build the European nation and the international capitalist system. This is what determines our reality and the contours of the struggle in which we have been engaged for more than 500 years. Listen, I want to read this again. We say that Africans are not a race, but a nation of people forcibly dispersed across the globe. We have been pushed out of history by our imperialist oppressors, partially through the concept of race. Our national homeland has been occupied in various ways for millennia. Our people have been captured and shipped around the world as capitalist commodities, like cabbages and chickens and furniture. Our labor and land have been violently extracted to build the European nation and the international capitalist system. This is what determines our reality and the contours of the struggle in which we have been engaged for more than 500 years. The fight against Africom cannot be characterized as a struggle against racism any more than the liberation of our people in Haiti from France in 1804, or the necessary unification of Africa to stop the rape of our motherland and the theft of its resources. The material conditions Africans suffer worldwide have their origin in the attack on Africa that led to the capture of our national homeland and our people. Our poverty and susceptibility to ignorance, violence, and material want throughout the world, including the US, UK, and the rest of Europe, result from the material conditions of existence in Africa since its capture and partition. Are the Iraqis and Afghans fighting against racism? What about the people of South America and the Caribbean? Certainly the bourgeois ideology of racism serves to unite the vast majority of whites and even some Africans in support of the imperialist agenda. Increasingly though, this ideology is running up against the material reality of a global power shift, where the oppressed are clearly the locomotive of history. More and more whites are themselves running from their own racial designation. Patrick Buchanan, whose worldview is informed by assumptions of white superiority that we recognize as racism, is himself alarmed by the growing evidence that shifting power relations are chasing whites away from solidarity with their racial identity. Apparently, this phenomenon has achieved such significance that Buchanan has conceptualized it as ethnomasochism. In his book, Suicide of a Superpower, Buchanan laments, and this is the quote from Buchanan: "Questions about the future arise. If the end of white America is a cultural and demographic inevitability, what will the new mainstream of America look like? And what ideas or values might it rally around? What will it mean to be white after whiteness no longer defines the mainstream? Will anyone mourn the end of white America? Will anyone try to preserve it?" One reaction, Professor Hisu reports, is that among cultural elites, some are shedding their white identity. This is someone who Buchanan is quoting here. If white America is losing control and the future will belong to people who can successfully navigate a post-white multicultural landscape, then it's no surprise that many white Americans are eager to divest themselves of their whiteness entirely. This is the quote inside this quote. The day after Obama's inaugural, television host Larry King blurted out to an uneasy Bob Woodward a secret desire of his son. He's quoting King now. "My younger son, Cannon, is 8, and he now says that he would like to be Black. I'm not kidding. He said there's a lot of advantages. Black is in. Is this a turning of the tide?" Unquote. This is from Buchanan's book. Indeed, Black is in. The tide has turned. Black is the future not because of some defeat of racism, but because Africans are part of the dispossessed, the wretched of the earth that are overturning a world social system whose ideological foundation is racism. This system is no longer able to withstand the tide of history, sweeping all forms of capitalist parasitism into the proverbial dustbin of history. The anti-racists would have us fight for a place in the dying system by fighting against its ideology instead of the system itself. In this way, they would have us objectively uniting with our oppressors. Anti-racists would transform us into house Negroes, fighting to save the master's burning mansion, to paraphrase Malcolm X. Parasitism is the essential question. Up to now, since the successful rise of imperialism some 500 years ago, Europe and white people have been the subjects, and Africans and others have been the objects of imperialist theory, history. Up to now, since the successful rise of imperialism some 500 years ago, Europe and white people have been the subjects, and Africans and others have been the objects of imperialist history. We have been voiceless and reduced to invisibility in stature and significance. Karl Marx characterized the slavery, rape, pillage, and genocide associated with the emergence of white power and our current status as so-called primitive accumulation. In another instance, he referred to slavery as, quote, an economic category of the greatest importance. In the book, One People, One Party, One Destiny, the political report to our 5th Congress, we commented on what that meant. That is how Karl Marx summed it up. Here is the relationship between, quote, we're quoting now from the book, because we're saying that, that Europeans have been subjects of history and they've reduced Africans into objects of history. And we're showing even an example of how Marx has done that. And I mentioned Marx in particular because he was a very important theoretician and one of the important philosophers who helped to define the communism for much of the world. Parasitism is the essential question up to now. So we go, I'm sorry, a couple of paragraphs down, we say in the book, One People, One Party, One Destiny, which is the political report to our 5th Congress, we commented on what Marx's characterization of the slavery, rape, pillage, and genocide associated with the emergence of white power and our current status as primitive accumulation. And we talk about what he characterized as slavery being an economic category of the greatest importance. This is Marx's definition. That's what I'm talking about. When Europe's a subject of history and we are objects of history, slavery is an object of history. The primitive accumulation, we are objects of history. These are definitions that facilitate what would be characterized as the development of Europe. This is the basis of the definition. It's not one that talks about or has as a center of the consequences of slavery for those who were enslaved. It's the consequence of slavery for the enslavers, for the European society. So anyway, in the book, One People, One Party, One Destiny, the political report to our 5th Congress, we commented on what that meant. Quote, here the relationship between peoples and countries is obscured and mystified. Marx attributes European development solely to the genius and productive forces inside of Europe. He is thereby covering over or liquidating the fact that this so-called development for Europe requires the parasitic impairment of the capacity for independent development in Africa and other places victimized by Europe. In another place in the political report, this rhetorical question was raised. Would capitalism and the resultant European wealth and African impoverishment have occurred without the European attack on Africa, its division, African slavery and dispersal, colonialism and neo-colonialism, unquote? The answer is obvious to anyone with even a smattering of historical knowledge. No, 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 and 1,000 times no, but Marx didn't get it. Most of our movement still doesn't get it. Revolutionaries around the world have missed this crucial understanding of the foundation of imperialist existence. The most erudite practitioners of the superstition called capitalist economics don't get it. This is one of the reasons nothing they say about the extant economic crisis of the imperialist world makes any sense. They can't make it make any sense. Our summation of this imperialist dilemma is reflected in this quote from One People, One Party, One Destiny. Quote, the North Americans, like most Europeans, assume they have some idea of the basis of the contradiction because of the fantasies passed on to them historically about the source of their comparative wealth and so-called good fortune. Nevertheless, those are resources stolen from others that have become increasingly difficult for them to afford in their malls and supermarkets. It is somebody else's oil, wrenched from the earth with bloody consequences for which they now have to pay more. The bauxite, coltan, gold, and diamonds, along with the cocoa beans, cotton, and cheaply produced clothing, have cost the rest of us dearly. And our combined struggles to seize control of our lives and resources are affecting the ability of North Americans and other Europeans to enjoy a parasitic economy that requires global misery for an oasis of white happiness, unquote. In reality, the essential feature of capitalism is parasitism. The inconsistent materialism of Patrick Buchanan, as well as Zbigniew Brzezinski cited in Chapter I of Uneasy Equilibrium, allows them to recognize some relationship between the decline of imperialism and the rise of formerly subject peoples. Yet their overarching philosophical idealism, a worldview stemming from white assumptions of superiority, blinds them to the dialectic between Western or so-called white success and African impoverishment. They cannot accept that the changing relations of power, exposing the real dependency, the dependency of the colonizer upon the colonized, and of whites on Africans. This is as true of the capitalism of Adam Smith, the 18th century free market proponent, as it is of the capitalism of Karl Marx, the 19th century scientific socialist. Wage labor, commodity production, private ownership and controls of the means of production are features of capitalism that function on the foundation of parasitism, the primitive accumulation that Marx correctly identified as the equivalent of original sin. This is the starting point of capitalist accumulation and production of the capitalist system itself. This is a fundamental statement here, a fundamental sentence. And I want to read it again because we are told all the time about how features of capitalism that help to define it are wage labor, commodity production, private ownership, and private ownership and control of the means of production. This is how capitalism is summed up for us by Marxists, by many others. When they talk about socialism, they said this is what constitutes the definition. These are defining features of capitalism. And then we hear people who engage a lot in talking about how capitalism makes itself manifest at any given time as a critical question. I was looking just the other day at one of the books, Foreign Affairs, from January and February of this year. And the title of the cover is The Future of Capitalism. And it's interesting that they have to have these discussions now because capitalism is obviously standing on shaky ground. And for them, for one of the contributors here, the question is not whether or not capitalism is facing extinction. The big question is, how will capitalism look? Will it look like a Chinese capitalism? Will it look like an American capitalism? That's what they are dealing with. And so they're missing the boat that all capitalism, all of it, what you call finance capital, that some people get all carried away and dealing with, frothing in the mouth and excitement, etc., is finance capital. All capitalism, whatever you call it, the capitalist system itself rests upon a foundation of colonial slavery. Slavery and colonialism, this is where it came from. Jesus, Jehovah, Allah, no supernatural force came and gave white people all the wealth and created the social system that is fighting for its very life now, to the extent that, and by the way, it's what has defined white success up to now. Of course, there's a tremendous amount of contention, as this Foreign Affairs book that I just mentioned would attest to. Which capitalism are we going to have dominating the world? Will it be the American version of capitalism or the Chinese version of capitalism? That's the debate that they would have. And what we're saying is, whatever version of capitalism you're looking at, it is a capitalism that is defined essentially and primarily by parasitism, that all of it rests upon a foundation of slavery and colonialism. That's our point. So we say wage labor, commodity production, private ownership and control of the means of production are features of capitalism that function on the foundation of parasitism, the so-called primitive accumulation that Karl Marx correctly identified as the equivalent of original sin. This is the starting point of capitalist accumulation and production of the capitalist system itself. This is not to say that everything that Marx said was wrong, but it is to say that everything he said must be reevaluated based on a material appreciation, on a materialist appreciation of the centrality of capitalist parasitism, what he called the primitive accumulation of capital. Otherwise, we will continue to be duped by those who verbally claim to oppose capitalism, but who cannot oppose parasitic capitalism. The reality that capitalism rests upon the backs of Africans, indigenous, and oppressed peoples everywhere. We are not Marxists, we are historical materialists. We have used the historical materialism of Marx, the science of investigation and the science of investigating and analyzing society, to investigate and analyze our reality as Africans. Our findings prove that we are a part of the so-called primitive accumulation mentioned by Marx in his works. Malcolm X, a materialist of sorts in his own right, has been quoted as saying that a person watching someone sitting on a hot stove would describe the experience differently from the person actually sitting on the stove. This is true. The spectator is not required to have a full understanding of the experience. The victim of the hot stove is provoked by his reality. It becomes a historical necessity to understand the question. Using the collective experience of African people as a starting place, using the collective experience of African people as a starting place, we were able to use the science of dialectical and historical materialism, cleansing it of its Marxist metaphysics and idealism, to investigate and analyze our relationship to the world. For us, the rise of capitalism in the world is not based on some purely abstract Marxist theory about the development of human society. It is not a theoretical question. Primitive accumulation is not a theory. The rape of Africa, the enslavement of our continent and our people, the forcible dispersal of Africans throughout the world as a means of rescuing Europe from disease and poverty, the process that gave rise to capitalism, is a matter of historical record. Marx, the spectator, did not have to understand this. The person sitting on the hot stove, the living, breathing, thinking, so-called primitive accumulation would either understand this question or perish. We chose to understand. More than that, we chose to develop a worldview stemming from this understanding. This is the origin of African internationalism. African internationalism is simply the worldview stemming from a historical materialist investigation and analysis of the world, with the starting point being the experience and role of Africans and Africa in the advent of capitalist imperialism as the rise of white power. African internationalism is simply the worldview stemming from a historical materialist investigation and analysis of the world, with the starting point being the experience and role of Africans and Africa in the advent of capitalist imperialism as the rise of white power. Parasitic capitalism is the real issue. It is this reality that ultimately distinguishes African internationalist socialism from the struggle for white rights that usually characterizes most movements of Europeans worldwide. It is the difference in socialism resulting from overturning the pedestal upon which all capitalist activity occurs, and some variation of the National Socialism achieved by the infamous Nazis of Germany. In the past few years, the crisis of imperialism has thrust a number of North Americans and Europeans into motion, from Tea Partiers and Wall Street occupiers in the US to thousands of militants in Greece, Spain, Brazil, and other crisis-ridden countries. White people have been mobilized by the inability of capitalism to live up to their expectations. They are demanding to be restored to their rightful place atop the pedestal of capitalist prosperity, sharing in the stolen loot of colonial plunder. The problem is that this can only happen at the expense of the well-being of the historical victims of capitalist prosperity, the subject and colonial peoples of the world whose exploited labor and resources create the pedestal upon which all white people sit. Europe's economic uncertainty has been brought about by oppressed peoples who are currently fomenting the crisis with our struggle for the recapture of our resources, our sovereignty, dignity, and our history. It is an error to assume that primitive accumulation is dead history, something that happened a long time ago with no implications for today. The truth is that today's capitalist imperialist structures, the ones being challenged in 1,000 different ways, are structures that originated in the very genesis of capitalism as it emerged through the assault on Africa and the majority of humanity from the primordial sludge of backward and disease-ridden Europe. These understandings of African internationalism require action. They are not for consumers of information. Our party's theory is the only body of political understanding that can make sense of what is happening in the world today. Our African internationalist theoretical contributions serve to break the shackles historically imposed on revolutionary theory as perceived through the lens of oppressor nation intellectuals, whose worldview was determined by their existence on the pedestal of our oppression. African internationalism, for the first time, allows the Africans and the oppressed of the world to become the subjects of history, defining our own destiny, something not possible with the theory of Marx or his contemporaries and followers. Today, the conditions of the real world manifested by the crisis of imperialism are beginning to confirm what African internationalism has so long predicted. The reality of primitive accumulation of capital and the fact that capitalism was born at the expense of the suffering in Africa of African and indigenous people and is therefore parasitic. The reality of Africans as one people dispersed around the world who are colonized wherever we may be located. The understanding that African people live under a policy of US counterinsurgency in the US and counterinsurgency globally. These are some African internationalist understandings whose significance is becoming recognized by the world. Seeing the world as it is, not as we wish it were. African people, like all humanity, have always been motivated by the struggle to understand our place and destiny in the world. We, like others, have, through our collective life experiences, been compelled to find answers to the fundamental philosophical questions revolving around the primacy of the spiritual versus the material world. What is the basis of our oppression? Can the answer be found in religious scripture? Are we oppressed because we have offended the gods, or perhaps sought solace from the wrong gods? Are the white colonial oppressors and some of the African petty bourgeoisie correct when they say we are experiencing the consequences of insufficient civilization or inadequate education, or that we are morally depraved? Those who see the spiritual as primary are philosophical idealists. For them, the idea of reality is greater than reality itself. For idealists, the real material world is dependent on the spiritual. Philosophical idealists do not look for answers about the nature of the world by examining the world itself. They see the world as the creation of an external force that is incapable of standing up to scientific investigation. This is a ruling class worldview that is funneled into the consciousness of the working masses through the African petty bourgeoisie, as well as other petty bourgeois and bourgeois mediums. Philosophical idealism assumes that there are things that humans are unable to comprehend. It claims that the hand of the mysterious is somehow responsible for what we perceive as reality. During the historical period when our party was founded, philosophical idealism was central to the worldview of the Black liberation movement, which relied mainly on religious, moral, and colonial explanations to understand and analyze our situation. African philosophical idealists of that period sought explanations for our conditions of existence and our future in the articulations of great leaders, or simply in the consciousness of the Black liberation movement itself. In other words, the idealists accepted the movement and its leaders' own definition as primary, rather than fundamentally examining the actual material conditions that gave rise to the movement and its leaders. Other philosophical idealists with whom our movement had to contend were the various white liberals, including those who defined themselves as so-called leftists. Many of the white leftists relied on religious and moral explanations for their analysis, attributing our oppression to the flawed character of our oppressors. According to these idealists, our oppressors were people who had strayed from the American or European moral ideal. You hear that a lot when people are discussing how Trump and the Republican Party are moving today, that somehow this is not the America, this is not the real America, that this is some contrived thing that misinterprets or misrepresents what America is, what we are confronting within the world today. In this way, the white liberals were not that different from the Black petty bourgeois leaders of the Black liberation movement. White leftist ideological intervention often represents itself in the paternalistic condescending tendency to approach the issue of the oppression of African people from a predetermined assumption of the universality of the white experience. This Eurocentric viewpoint shows that the leftists have pretty much the same view as all other whites. Often influenced by Karl Marx, many so-called leftists deny being philosophical idealists. Their idealism, nevertheless, is reflected in their demand that Africans, the indigenous of the Americas, and the majority of the world's peoples understand our history as objects of European defined and experienced history. From their perspective, Africans and others are relegated to the position of auxiliary forces whose ultimately unhappy destiny, independent of our will, history, and experience, is to facilitate the emergence of the industrial or white working class as the new ruling class in a utopian post-capitalist world. The African People's Socialist Party sprang from the very bowels of the remorseless reality and struggles of our people. As we developed, we were increasingly forced to shed all reliance on religion, other forms of superstition, and the goodwill or moral epiphany of our oppressors. Our struggle to understand our reality, while occasionally encumbered and influenced by the worldview of the educated and upper classes, were rooted in attempts to solve the real problems of the concrete contradictions in which our people are embroiled. We were forced to learn that our preconceived notions gleaned through colonial civics books, preachers, and liberal white friends only helped to obscure the real contradictions with which our people are confronted. We came to recognize that we must understand the world just as it is, not as we would wish it to be. We were forced to become philosophical materialists. Materialism teaches us that the world is tangible, knowable, and can be experienced through the senses. It teaches us that all existing phenomena result from material causes that come into being and develop and pass away according to the laws of the motion of matter. Materialism informs us that the material world is primary. It is objective reality that exists independently of the mind and will of individuals. It does not require the permission of gods or important persons for its existence, that is the material world. The development of the African People's Socialist Party during our historical, at this time, 41-year trajectory in the midst of intense struggle compelled us to understand that the savage and genocidal brutality inflicted upon our people and the world by Europeans or whites has a material basis. It is not due to the will of the gods or simply some moral deficiency on the part of whites. While the humanity of Europeans was clearly open to suspicion, the original Nation of Islam, for example, declared the white man to be the devil. But anyway, the answer to the avaricious motivations of white people is not to be found in an examination of morality, religion, or genetics. Our party and movement were forced to conclude that all humans, including Europeans, are trapped by an absolute necessity to secure and develop the means of subsistence. In other words, the primary motivating factor in human society is the production and reproduction of life. Without life, all other questions, religion, culture, genetics, etc., are moot, meaningless. Indeed, culture is a byproduct of the process of producing and reproducing life. However, the process of Africans producing and reproducing life was drastically disrupted and altered by the European attack that resulted in the capture and colonial enslavement of Africa and Africans. This attack by Europeans on Africa also resulted in the imposition of artificial borders that separate the dispersed African nation from our human and material resources and from a meaningful relationship among ourselves and with the peoples of the world. The material and human resources of Africa have gone to satisfy the requirements of life for Europeans at the expense of Africa and Africans. The process of Africans producing and reproducing life has not been primarily for Africa and Africans. It has been primarily for Europe and the white world at our experience. This progenitor of world capitalism, the attack on Africa and Africans, along with the European assault on Asia and the Americas, rescued Europe and Europeans from an oppressive 1,000-year-long disease-ridden, impoverished existence known as feudalism. This was the genesis of the capitalist system as a world economy created on a base of the enslavement of Africans and others. Comrade Director, I see you waiting for us to move forward. Should I stop now?
Uhuru, I would say well, yeah.
Should I stop?
Yeah, it's gonna take a little while to get to the next subsection, so
okay.
It might be a little longer than 3 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, you have about a little, well, you have
I can read more
to get through. I said you have about 1.5 pages to get through.
Should I proceed?
Yeah, let's just do that before the next
okay.
subhead.
Yeah, okay. I think it's important. I really hope comrades will study this. I really hope comrades will study this. A scientific analysis of human society requires that we take a dialectical approach. We cannot see the world as static and ready-made. Society has to be analyzed as a process that is in a constant state of motion, change, and development. There's always something new arising to replace the old, and all social motion occurs in relationship to this process of coming into existence and dying away. Europe's attack on Africa was effectively an assault on Africa's ability to produce life for itself. This assault has had the effect of pushing Africa and Africans out of history, history being the summation of the ongoing struggle to produce and reproduce life. Slavery, genocide, and colonialism are the stuff of which capitalism was born. African enslavement was first capital in the development of capitalism. The prevailing legal system, culture, religion, and general philosophical outlook or worldview constitute the superstructure of capitalism thus conceived. This superstructure is a natural product and reflection of this economic base of colonial slavery. Slavery and colonialism gave rise not only to capitalism, but also to the capitalist and working class alike of Europe and North America. The workers and the bourgeoisie, the two primary capitalist defining classes, have occasionally fought great battles with each other since their inception as contending social forces. Nevertheless, both were born and developed on a platform of slavery and colonialism. Consequently, what is often called class struggle inside the US and Europe is actually contention among the workers and the ruling class for control of the parasitic capitalist pedestal and its rotten and its stolen resources. Again, what is often called class struggle inside the US and Europe is actually contention among the workers and the ruling class for control of the parasitic capitalist pedestal and its stolen resources. And part of what helps you to understand that is, regardless of what else is being said, they will fight among themselves, the capitalists and the so-called worker class in Europe, but they will not fight to overturn the relationship that they have with colonialism. So it's about who's going to get what from the colonial process. The parasitic foundation of world capitalism continues to exist up to now as a true economic base upon which the entire superstructure of the capitalist-defined, capitalist-dominated world rests. The total existence of white people and their ability to produce and reproduce life is dependent on this parasitic relationship that came into being with the attack by feudal Europe on Africa and the world. Instead of separate, more or less self-contained worlds existing in casual relationship to each other, there is one capitalist world system united by a parasitic economic relationship imposed by Europe upon the rest of us. There is therefore no European reality separate from that of Africa and the rest of the world. The entire world is now locked into a single dialectical process, a unity of opposites, whereupon the gruesome extraction of life and resources from Africa and the rest of the world is a condition for the life and development of what we now know as Europe, white people, and the capitalist system to which we have been forcibly affixed. The legal system, culture, white sense of sameness, and political institutions are reflections of this parasitic economic base. Every white aspiration and dream, every expectation for happiness and a good life, from a successful marriage to a secure future for their children, requires drone strikes in Pakistan, police murders and mass imprisonment in the African colonies and barrios of the US, and starvation and forced displacement of the oppressed throughout the world. I'll stop there. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman. Thank you so much for this really incredible part one of the study of African internationalism. I think that this chapter and just the analysis and the overview that you've given up to now has just been really, really extremely helpful. So we do have questions that have come in, but before we do, I just want to recognize where people are watching from. We have viewers in Lawrenceville, Georgia, St. Louis, Missouri, St. Petersburg, Florida, Bermuda, Boston, Massachusetts, South Africa, occupied Tanzania, United Kingdom, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Kuwait, Huntsville, Alabama, San Diego, California, Minneapolis, Minnesota, the Netherlands, Oakland, California, Lakeland, Florida, Los Angeles, California, Trinidad, Pinellas Park, Florida, Brooklyn, New York, Richmond, Virginia, Arizona, Queens, New York, and Uganda. So we have forces watching all over the world today. And we're actually going to first revisit some questions that were asked last week that we weren't able to get to. We had two questions that we were not able to get to last week. So, and last week's study was based on studying the chapter 10 on the African nation in the same book. So the first question came from Daryl Cheatham, and his question was, why is capitalism failing?
Capitalism is failing because it was built upon a foundation of slavery and colonialism. It's a parasite in its ability to extract continuously the resources from those of us who are colonized and oppressed is the basis for its success. It's failing now. For essentially the primary basis for its failure is the ongoing resistance of peoples around the world to take back our own resources for ourselves. This is one of the reasons you see the capitalists in the United States attacking Iran and attacking Venezuela and attacking Iraq, trying to maintain this relationship with people from whom they exploit tremendous amounts of resources that keep this thing afloat. And then also what you have, especially as the struggles of the peoples intensify, the limitations that's imposed on capitalist extraction and production, you see a growing contest between capitalists themselves that contribute to the deepening contradiction. You see the rise of forces like China, who's contesting the hegemony of the United States over the capitalist world. And you see the reinvention of Russia under Putin in particular, that's challenging the status quo. I mean, these are just some of the factors that give rise to the deepening contradictions of capitalism. So capitalism is not now a failing. Capitalism has never worked for the vast majority of the peoples of the world. We often talk about how the vast majority of people, 80% of the people, for example, on Earth, trying to survive off less than $10 US a day. And then, of course, we look at Africa and other places, it's even worse than that. So capitalism has never worked for us. It had never worked for even African people who live in places like the United States in general. It never works for African people who live in places throughout Europe where whites have been made wealthy and live quite well with the extensive holiday periods paid for, pregnancy leaves and stuff like that on the one hand. On the other hand, you look at the African communities in all of these places in Europe and North America, and you see that capitalism has never worked for us. So it can't work. It's not a workable social system. It's a parasite, and it has to feed on the resources of the peoples in order for it to be successful. And it has incorporated into this process the vast majority of colonial citizens, of colonizers, to defend it and fight for it and to maintain this relationship, but it's never worked. Uhuru.
Uhuru, thank you, Chairman. Our next question comes from Ngone who lives in Tampa, Florida, who asked last week, salute Chairman, when Africa is liberated, what will be done about the millions of settlers living there, Chinese, Indians, etc.?
Well, we had some discussion about that last Sunday when we talked about the whole question of the nation. And what will be done depends in a real large sense of the world on what they do and what the Indians, the Chinese, and the others do in terms of affecting the rise of Black power, the fighting for Black power, and becoming one with the working class, which means also returning stolen resources to African people. And these stolen resources is what distinguishes them even more than their color and things like that from the rest of African people. These resources have to come back to the working class. And then they have to fight for the liberation of Africa and the rise of Black power. And that gives them an opportunity to commit national suicide so that they're no longer Asians and Chinese, and they're no longer whites. They can become Africans by committing class suicide, by actively engaging in the struggle to eliminate any external force of controlling Africa and fighting for the actual acquisition by African working class of all of its resources. This is their way to commit national suicide and become one with Africa. Uhuru.
Uhuru, thank you, Chairman. We're going to get into questions that have come in today. And I just want to also acknowledge, we had some people say where they're watching from while you were answering those questions. So we have also Atlanta, Georgia, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, Peekskill, New York, Spain, Brazil, and Jamaica on today.
Uhuru.
All right, so questions from today. We're going to go to, the first question is on YouTube. Uhuru, Chairman, given slavery and colonialism never ended, does this mean that primitive accumulation wasn't just a pre-capitalist starting point, but its current umbilical cord? And that comes from Morty in Richmond, Virginia.
Well, the thing is that what Marx characterized as primitive accumulation really is the expropriation of value from Africa and from other oppressed peoples around the world that went to Europe. That never ended. That never ended. I mean, we criticize Marx in part because what he defines as primitive accumulation is simply a definition to explain the development of Europe. And in fact, it does not explain the development of Europe. What it helps us to do is to understand the assault on Africa. So when Marx talks about this, he's speaking with Europe being the subject of history. And we speak of African internationalism, we are speaking as objects. We are now the objects of history, and Europe, we are the subjects of history, and Europe are now the objects of history. We are defining the world in a fashion that contributes to the emancipation of the of the African and the peoples of the world from the stranglehold that Europe has imposed on it, and that Marx has characterized as primitive accumulation. And so doing, explaining the development of Europe, but not giving an explanation of what has happened to the rest of us. We're not even real in a certain way, except as we exist for the purpose of European development.
Uhuru. Next question comes from Nasir Alamin in Kuwait. Says, I appreciate the chairman's point that parasitic capitalism is a continuous assault on Africans' ability to effectively reproduce life for ourselves. Can the chairman speak to the capitalist utilization of Obama as a tool to keep us trapped in this parasitic relationship? It's said that Obama influenced the NBA players to end their strike in favor of the NBA helping with voter turnout. And a similar question, so I'm just going to combine it together from Mbabi Ntama. Says, not just Obama, that's the relation between African political organizations and the left or progressive all over the world. So being able to identify how the left, progressives, and Black celebrities join forces to stop Black people's mobilization worldwide. I wish the chairman can teach us on that.
Yeah, they're strike breakers. They're strike breakers, and that's really very clear. And that's also why we have this discussion. We talk about theory. We're talking about having to fight against the opportunists. We talk about those who are obscure the real relationship that Africans and oppressed peoples and working people around the world have with the US and other imperialist forces. They are strike breakers. And that's why the struggle against opportunism is a critical struggle at this moment, because people want revolution. The fact is that what happened with the Democratic Party and the Republican parties and how many of the so-called leftists are so engrossed in that as being the determining factors, the reality is the most dynamic forces, social forces in this country right now were those forces who rose up in rebellions and protests all around this country, and they just don't have leadership, this spontaneity that has determined that. So Obama's a strike breaker, and all of the people I see promoting John Lewis, that's why they dragged out John Lewis' corpse and threw it in the Capitol, whatever you call this place, the first Negro congressperson to ever be there. Yeah, they need him there. They need anything that helps people to say that what you got to do to get out of this is vote, and to tether the people to the United States. It's like that hyphen, you know, when you look at the so-called African American, Afro-American, et cetera, that is tethering us and our future to the United States, as opposed to being a future with Africa and a future with the oppressed and liberated peoples of the world. So they're strike breakers, and this massive thing that Sharpton, and we call him charlatan for good reason. Al Sharpton held with all of these reactionary, well, all of these bourgeois forces that promoted it, put it out, saying Black people go to Washington D.C. to support this, and where you can't even get media to come out to a press conference that's going to deal with actually helping to mobilize people to contend with the system. And, you know, so that's what we're looking at. And unfortunately, you know, most of these athletes, you know, who have an outsized influence for masses of the people, you don't see white people running around trying to get political solutions from basketball players. You don't see the white world trying to get political solutions from forces like that. It's Africans who end up following them. And that's not so. The thing that makes that a real problem is that the basketball players are not influenced by revolutionary theory, revolutionary philosophy, and connected to revolutionary organization. Because if they're not connected to revolutionary organization, they're connected to Obama. If they're connected to Obama, they're connected to the Democratic Party. If they are connected to the Democratic Party, they're connected to imperialism, colonial imperialism that oppresses us. And that's part of what we meant when we talked about the significance of philosophy theory, understanding what it is you're connected to, where your future, where you are in the world, how you got here, and where it is that you have to go and what it's going to take to do that. Democratic Party will never take us there. And hell, you don't know what the Democratic Party is going to be tomorrow. Right now, you see it morphing more and more to Trumpism. I mean, who is the guy who heads the Democratic Party now? His name, Joe Biden, is now, they say Joe Biden is a great contender with Trump because he's just Trump-like. So all the white people who love Trump, they can love Biden too, and they love Biden now because Biden is nicer. They say
they're presenting Biden as a nice guy. So Biden is nicer than Trump. So he won't talk about how he's grabbing white women in their private parts. He won't do stuff like that. Not Biden, he just grabs them in public and kisses them, feels them up and stuff like that, which has become and he's a thief. And his son's a thief, a family of thieves on both instances. But we are locked into this assumption, and we are locked into an assumption of powerlessness. There's an assumption that if you're not, if Trump gets it, oh, woe is us. There's an assumption if you don't work for the Democratic Party or within the social system, woe is us. And the fact is that we have more power when we are outside of the Democratic Party than we have inside, because at least then we were fighting like hell, even if we were fighting for the wrong things. It wasn't the Democratic Party that got Africans the right to quote unquote vote, if you want to characterize that. It was Fannie Lou Hamer, you know, who was the closest thing, a sharecropper in Mississippi. It was Ella Baker. It was folk like that who walked these hills and fought these crackers in these dirt roads in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia. That's how that happened, not the Democratic Party. And it's not going to get us out of this situation either. So a pox on both their houses. And so, yeah, the basketball players, and, you know, I love them, I guess I do. And some of them, you know, and I love some of the football players. And I love the Afro-Japanese woman, tennis player, who says that she's not going to play. And she's at least going so far as to say what's happening to Africans in this country is genocide. I thought that was an interesting statement from her. So, I mean, the struggle of the people has unleashed all these forces. Black people rising up allowed Black athletes to be significant, not athletes allowing Black people rising up. Black workers in the streets allowed these Africans who were so concerned about their contracts and their endorsement monies and stuff like that, they would never say anything. So masses of African people start burning the corporations that gave them the endorsement money and make the corporation themselves have to say Black Lives Matter, we love Black people, etc. That's what made it possible for all of them to do that. And I appreciate the fact that they've done it, but that's not what we rely on. And if they're in bed with Obama, which means they're in bed with the Democratic Party, the outcome of that is disastrous. There's no telling what kind of disease you can get from that kind of relationship. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman, thank you so much. That was so clarifying, and just the significance of having our own theory. You about to say something else?
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
Looked like you about to. All right. Uhuru, that was incredible. All right. So this next question comes from Comrade Sovek, and he asks, are we African internationalist atheists?
Well, you know, we are not superstitious at all. We don't believe in any kind of superstition. We want to liberate people from superstition. We want people to recognize the power of the people, our own capacity to change the world. I had a discussion with my nephew on yesterday. He's a preacher, and he was doing some work at my house, and he came to me. And one time, he used to be a political force. He came to me and he said that, you know, are there things that you see that happens that just have to be explained as otherworldly coming? And I said, no. There are things that happen that I might not know how it happened. There are a lot of things that I might not know how it happens, but there's nothing that happens that I think I cannot understand. There's some things I don't understand, but there's nothing that we can't understand. And the point we turn our lives, our future, our imagination to this place where some supernatural force has to define it for us, then there's no longer a basis for asking a question. There's no longer a basis for investigating. There's no longer a basis for us as human beings taking control of our own lives. So I'm not dodging the question about atheism. I just hate the terms because in some ways I almost equate that as another form of religion. I think I'm a normal person and I just believe in one less God than most people.
Uhuru, thank you so much, Chairman Uhuru. Our next question comes from, I think this is Langston on YouTube. Uhuru, can you briefly explain why colonialism supersedes white supremacy as the problem we must target? Many consider the two ideas to be one and the same.
Yeah, many are confused on that question. I agree. You will not hear me fighting you about the level of confusion. And that's on purpose, because this thing they call white supremacy is an idea. You don't hear people coming up the concrete means of fighting white supremacy. When the Vietnamese understood that they were fighting against French colonialism, it told them what they do. They didn't walk around talking about there's white supremacy that's happening here. That's not to say that the philosophy underpinning colonialism, underpinning capitalist white power did not exist in Vietnam and other places. In fact, in South Vietnam, there was a great money-making capacity by barbers of all people to participate in snipping the eyes of Vietnamese people to try to snip them to make them look round like white people. The fact is, it was colonial domination that allows the Europe to control us and control how we perceive ourselves and perceive the world. It's not some white supremacy. That's a concept. That's not even real. Colonialism is real. It makes itself manifest with armies, with guns, with tanks, and with police who shoot us down in the streets. So if we have a perception of ourselves that's unnatural, and all of us, most of us have unnatural perception of ourselves, is due to our relationship with external hostile forces that we call the colonizer. So how do you fight against white supremacy? You know, what is that? You know, how do you struggle against it? I don't know. Does that mean white people in charge of your lives? That means the colonizer in charge of your life. If that's what you mean, then say the colonizer in charge of our life, and you don't call that white supremacy, you call that colonial domination. And that's what it is, colonialism. And so the difference is, when you say colonialism, you are informed by how to take it on, overturning it, destroying it, wiping it out. And this concept of white supremacy is a concept that's used to obscure a political and economic relationship that we have. A political and economic relationship that we have is being obscured with this concept of white supremacy. Uhuru.
Uhuru. Thank you, Chairman. Nasir Alamin says, be careful of the DNC STD. That's clever.
That comment is such a subdued kind of comrade. So that's yeah.
All right, thank you, Nasir. So this next question comes from Dwight Davidson on Facebook. Asks, is the capitalist class attempting to move the seat of capitalism from America to China? I ask because it seems that when Nixon and Kissinger visited China, the Cultural Revolution stopped, the capitalist leaders were released from prison, and America and Europe began to ship its manufacturing to China.
No, I think what's happening is that the Americans and Europeans played China cheap. They really thought that they saw this great market in China. And what I want to also say is that the capitalist class is not a homogeneous entity, that they are in contention with themselves, even as they struggle to maintain and preserve capitalism. They have different kinds of interests within the capitalist system itself. And each of them is constantly fighting to elevate their interests in contention with others. And that's why we say that this whole elections are non-violent contests between contending sectors of the bourgeoisie, contending sector, and they had established this international relationship that's called the Atlanticist Club, if you will, after the Second Imperialist World War. So all of the white powers could contend peacefully with each other in this arrangement. And this was a white club, effectively, and had set up arrangements and rules and regulations so that that nobody could affect it. That they had this this executive body of the United Nations, for example, that could negate any decision that came from the greater body, etc. So this is the arrangement, and they say within this arrangement, all capitalists can contend with each other. Now, we don't have to go to war in Germany against England. We don't have to go to war with each other, because here is this nonviolent vehicle, this vehicle that we can contend with each other without violence, and then we can collectively make a decision about how we're going to loot the rest of the damn world. We can do this collectively. We can vote on it. And so this is the kind of situation. So you have these contending capitalist forces. But when you had this arrangement coming into existence that I've just talked about, this Atlanticist arrangement, which has never been absolutely satisfactory. I mean, it was done primarily to prevent fights among the white powers for domination among themselves for who's going to get what from the other oppressed people. It was also done to contain Russia, that at the time was known as the Soviet Russia. And so it's never been something that's worked in absolute harmony, but there was enough harmony there for them to dominate. So you have this contending relations. And now you had this situation where the US is fighting Vietnam. It wants to negate some of the influence, some of the support that Vietnam is getting from China. You have also the US, the whole body of capitalists who really see China as this prostate entity with 1 billion people that we can go in and we can loot it, we can set up all of these corporations. We got this huge market in China. So they thought China was easy prey. And so that's why they went into China. That's why they moved all the stuff. Labor was cheap. And that was one of the things China had gone from, this huge labor pool. And of course, labor is one of the most expensive part of the productive process. And so they saw China as easy prey. And so what happened, of course, is that the rabbit really picked up the gun when they went into China. The whole Chinese method of guerrilla warfare that's been deployed and that Mao taught so much about, even though this was not a Maoist operation, they allowed the West, the US to come in, Europe to come in, and they brought all of these resources into China. They're complaining now because China is what they call it, intellectual theft. And how can the US claim anybody? How can the so-called West talk about intellectual theft as much as they have stolen from Black people, song, music, art, science, and everything? But now the Chinese are intellectual thieves because they, and other things, so that China didn't play fair. So the point is that you have a huge contest going on now with sectors of the bourgeoisie. I mean, they're running cruise warships through areas of the South China Sea, trying to threaten China. They're trying to organize all kinds of forces to deal with China because there's contention there between both of these entities. So no, there's no deal that's been made like that. They wanted to make a deal. It was Brzezinski and Obama and people like that. They wanted to make a deal. They wanted China and Russia to come in and be a part of this operation, but they wanted to run things. And they made the mistake in assuming that China and Russia will be willing to sit at a table that's dominated by them, even as they were in a state of decline. And China and Russia could see their own interests and did not want to play the game as junior partners to the United States, and they didn't. And you see the consequences now. And so right now, Chinese economy is running full steam ahead. And I'm seeing predictions that shortly China will be the world dominant economy as opposed to the United States. So because of how China has dealt with the COVID pandemic and versus how the United States and Europe have dealt with them, and China's chugging along and the United States is playing catch up. Of course, we have problems. When saying this, it's not an endorsement of China. It is recognition of the contradictions that we're looking at and how we should understand them, that capitalism is capitalism, and it doesn't matter. And for us, the whole question of the colonial domination of Africa is fundamental. It doesn't matter to us if it's Chinese, Indian, Turkish, American, Canadian, French, and sometimes people are talking about, look at what China's doing in Africa. What about France? France controls 15 different entities in Africa. And along with the United States and these other forces that are strangling and stealing all kinds of resources, all of them got to go. Africa has to be liberated from any force that stands between our capacity to produce life for ourselves as African people. Uhuru.
Uhuru, thank you so much, Chairman, for that answer. Our next question comes from Comrade Tafari Mugeri, who's the chairman of the African People's Socialist Party in occupied Zaire, or otherwise known as South Africa. He says, my question is on this idea that capitalism was emerging across the world, that it was inevitable, that Africa was semi-feudal when it was attacked, that it was gonna be advanced to capitalism And yeah, he wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, that's a really, I'm glad you raised that, Comrade, because there's this assumption that for people who have accepted without qualification this whole Marxist interpretation of the development of human society, which presupposes that all human society went through this process, and that the emergence of capitalism is a consequence of development of society. And if you say instead that capitalism came into existence as a world economy, as a consequence of looting and Africa and colonizing Africa and the rest of the world, then that disrupts this whole notion, which also rooted in that is the assumption that somehow of a certain supremacy of Europe itself, that somehow Europe, is leading the world. It goes through this processes of development from the lower level of development of society to the higher level, but the highest level being, of course, communism, which follows capitalism. And so our intellectuals who have accepted this definition of the development of human society find themselves in a quandary when trying to sometimes even explain why they didn't see in Africa some of the same phenomenon that they called like the emergence of the capitalist state and the state looking as it did in Europe. And they say that is because Africa hasn't developed to this point that you have the state. You don't have the same kind of class contradictions, they say. They can't explain that because that means Africa's underdeveloped if you don't have these class contradictions that they saw in Europe, and that's nonsense. And this is the Marxists and what have you would say things again like this is a manifestation of development. Why is it development? Because Europe got it. Because that's where it starts. You start from the premise that Europe is the highest expression of human society. Then everything else that's not like Europe is below it, and everything else is on the way to becoming like Europe in terms of its own development. Say, hell no, that's not true. The fact of the matter is you cannot find the success that you look at in Europe before you see colonial slavery. It was colonial slavery, and this can be quantified, and it has been quantified. More and more people are writing about it. What slavery meant, the enslavement, the capture of resources and people from Africa, how it altered the course of the world. When you look at all of the world, look at all of the Americas, look at the different countries and territories in the Americas. Most of them were given definition by the trade in Black people who went there as producers and produced for Europe, etc. And why is it that every time you see oil strike, workers in the fields in Nigeria, oil fields in Nigeria, some other places that wreaks havoc with the prices of oil and gas throughout the so-called industrial world. There's a direct relationship here. It is parasitic. And capitalism is a parasite that has been imposed on the body of humanity as a consequence of slavery and colonialism. I don't know if I spoke to that effectively or not, but it is a total misconception in people, especially African intellectuals, who have their understanding coming from European institutions and European influences. And this is not an anti-European thing, by the way. It is recognition that all societies come to certain conclusions about the world based on their requirements as societies. And that's the thing that thrusts Marx up, where the fall of feudalism in Europe, when feudalism as a social system collapsed, then that meant that all of the ideas that upheld that social system collapsed as well. And so there was this ideological drift that was happening, and all kinds of phenomena sprang forward to try to give an explanation of the world, anarchism, nihilism, and Marxism, just some of the expressions. And Marx became offered a philosophical explanation of the world that was emerging, that was dying in the world that was emerging. And when Marx's explanation, it was one that defined us, and because from the perspective that Marx was trying to solve a particular problem. All philosophy does that. trying to solve a particular problem in European society. And we were forces that were addressed and spoken of only as it related to addressing the problem that existed in Europe, and which doesn't mean that they didn't say anything about other places in the world, because Mark talked about Suriname and what that meant in terms of people being enslaved there, but it didn't talk about what it meant from the perspective of those who were enslaved. It was from the perspective of those who were analyzing and who were benefiting from that relationship, how that changed the society in Europe. We have to have our own philosophers. That's what this discussion is about. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman. Wow, we're on fire today. But Uhuru, thank you so much. The next question comes from Life Malcolm. Asks, what are some tactics and strategies we can use to organize the pre-revolutionary energy brimming in the world right now?
Well, I think this is part of what we have to do. You know, one thing we must remember is that we're engaged in a protracted struggle. And to say it's protracted doesn't necessarily mean today the same thing it meant 2 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 50 years ago, but it is protracted. And what it means in part is that revolution is a process, and it's not an event. It's not something that you can make happen when you want it to happen, but we do know some things. We know that right now, we see history moving rapidly. We see certain history, we see certain things, developments happening in terms of consciousness of the people that used to take 10, 15 years to occur. I mean, the party worked for almost 3 generations, knowing that it would happen, but before revolution was not even on the agenda. After the defeat of the revolution of the 1960s, 3 generations trying to complete that revolution that was halted at that time. And so we're talking about 3 generations now versus what's happened in the last 5 weeks, what's happened in the last 3 months, just incredible movement. What's happened in the last 5 years with the, and I think the real starting point was Ferguson in 2014. And right now we see history, moving rapidly, and how consciousness development is moving. So when we say it's protracted, we don't mean that it's going to take 3 more generations. The fact is that we see that every time this crisis of imperialism reveals itself to us with some alacrity, it's sharper. It takes us further. That's than it did the last time around. So in fact, we don't even know if the U.S. and the capitalist system is going to come out of this situation alive. And our objective, of course, is to deepen this crisis, et cetera. So what tactics that we can use to help the people come to a better place? And part of what we have to do right now, this is the responsibility of revolutionaries, is to take into mass struggle the science of revolution, the science of society, helping people to understand. And I'm not talking about having courses in philosophy in the middle of a demonstration or something like that, in the middle of a destruction of a police station or something like that. But I'm saying that we have to inform the activity of masses of people who are even engaged or thinking about engaging. And guess what? The people can hear better now than they could when they were not involved in burning down a police station, when they were not involved in these struggles in the streets. There's a lot of clarity, and more people are involved in burning down a police station. The more they're involved in having these massive protests, the more they are looking themselves to what end? To what end? They are trying to figure this out in motion. So we provide that information to them. We do that with studies such as what we're doing now, but of course we need to be intervening in the actions themselves. We need to be in the streets with the masses of people. We need to be there with our propaganda. We need to be there with our banners. We need to be there seizing the microphone and helping people to understand there must be a to what end, helping people to understand that it is colonial capitalism, that is to say a capitalism with its foundation on slavery and colonialism, that has to be destroyed if we're going to make any change in the world today. So that's what we have to do. We have to engage with the masses of people, taking science. People don't need us to teach them how to throw a brick or burn a police station down, or actually organize demonstration. What the people need science. They need revolutionary understanding of what the hell, why am I burning it down, whether I should burn it down, or something to that effect. That's what we have to take to the masses of the people. They can do the rest of it, with our assistance, of course, but they can do the rest of it without that, because we see them doing it already. I mean, it's not like there's some great revolutionary organization out there saying, let's burn the police station. They're doing that already. They're fighting the pigs in the streets already. We have to give it science so that they come out of it understanding why it was done. And so that, the next time a siege of a police station happen, it might mean a lot more than what it might mean, a crescendo. It might mean something that reverberates throughout a particular city or state or country. It might give leadership to people everywhere. Uhuru.
Thank you, Chairman. So our next question comes from Comrade Hinnock in Bermuda. Says, Uhuru, Chairman, can you expound on those who look for African spirituality, voodoo, etc. In the movement? Expound on those who look for African spirituality, voodoo, etc. in the movement.
Well, I'm not saying you can't look for African spirituality and voodoo and what have you. But I am saying that as an explanation for what we ought to do, as an explanation that would of our condition circumstances, it's ridiculous. It's faulty. I mean, if voodoo and African spirituality were the solution, then we wouldn't be in this situation, because we had possession of those before the white man got there. And that's not to say that Europe was not effective in colonizing us by making an assault on belief systems that existed in the African world. But it is to say that that's not going to be our salvation. So I would stop by a voodoo ceremony and see, if we can get people to go to the next demonstration or get people to do something else. If the voodoo and spirituality stands between them and the ability to get involved in this struggle, then I don't know the difference in the voodoo spirituality or the Christian spirituality or the Islamic spirituality or the Rasta spirituality, any other kind of spirituality. I mean, the thing is that we want to mobilize the entire African nation. All African nation has to be mobilized, because we're involved in the struggle for national liberation. But that struggle for national liberation has to be led by the advanced detachment, the African working class. And the African working class is mobilized not based on religion at all, but based on a scientific assessment and analysis of our reality. And that's reflected in African internationalism. Uhuru.
Uhuru, thank you, Chairman. Our next question comes from Comrade Matsamela.
And I want to just say, comrades, we know you're there in Bermuda, and dig in and keep waging the struggle. And we know that the question that you raise is not just some purely abstract exercise in philosophical thought. So let's win it in Bermuda. Let's bring Bermuda home. Uhuru. Comrade Matsamela was about to say something.
Yes. He asked, how might we as African internationalists engage unionism and other forms of workers' organization in the workplace?
Well, I think unionism is a problem because that, attempts to, it's a form of economism that it assumes that in many instances, when it's proposed as a way forward by revolutionaries, I mean, we believe that workers should be organized to look out for and fight for their interests as workers, as laborers. We believe that all value created in human society comes as a consequence of what workers do. We just disagree with the Marxist assumption that the fundamental contradiction in society occurs at what they call the point of production. We say that the fundamental contradiction is at the point of the bayonet. It's the point of the bayonet that took us into this relationship that created the whole capitalist system itself. So I believe we should work within unions. I believe we should try to take the political education and science of revolution to the union. We need to take African internationalism into African and unions and all together. In fact, we had established as one of the tasks of our
of our party, the development of the African Internationalist Labor Union. And at one time had identified somebody who seemed to be coming into the African Internationalists. This person was out of South Africa as the point person to help to develop the African Internationalist Labor Union. I believe we should organize African labor all around the world. I believe that African workers around the world organized can shut the entire thing down, you know. But those workers would be a part of a revolutionary movement, of a revolutionary party. They would be African internationalists. And so I still think we have to, we know we have to build the African Internationalist Labor Union so that, and when we say labor union, we mean probably much more than what has been perceived of as unions, you know, in this country and much of Europe, because we're talking about the union that would include the market people who in our communities on the continent of Africa and Barbados and you know, various other places on the street corners in St. Petersburg, Florida. We want all of the people who work, who labor, who produce to be united, and also united with the aspirations of African people for total liberation from colonialism. They need to be anti-colonialists, anti-colonial unionists, not just unionists, you know, as it's usually understood here and most of what they call the West, which we could call the white.
The white. True, Chairman. Okay, so we're winding down in time. We might have room for maybe 2 more questions, but we'll see after this. So this comes from Eugene West, and he asks, explain the attempt to elect a woman of color, or African woman, and a false sympathizer to thwart the demand of revolution by the oppressed people and the illusion of the voting process.
Yeah, I mean, again, when you see the crisis of imperialism really deepens, which means in this country in particular, much of the world, it means oppressed people are rising up. So you have this an absolute need by the bourgeoisie, one, to lend a sympathetic ear or appear to lend a sympathetic ear to the interests and aspirations of African people. You have the need to try to get in front of and define how African people will resist. And so what's being told to African people that you can resist by voting for a black face of your oppressor. You can resist by voting for Kamala Harris. I mean, it's not even like Kamala Harris was as an Angela Davis, as simpering and liberal as she has always been. Yes, 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 yes. It's not like she even has that kind of pretext. She was a damn prosecutor, and not just a prosecutor in San Francisco or deputy in San Francisco or Oakland, but for the whole state of California. Her job was putting black people in jail. And I mean, Biden and Kamala Harris are an exactly perfect pair, because he is the one who got the 100,000 pigs that put in the streets that's killing black people and sending black people to jail and sending black people into the so-called criminal justice system. And Kamala was there waiting to get them, to give them time and things like that. So they are no friends of our people. Our interests can only be served by the African Revolution and a struggle, independent African effort of our own. That's the African People's Socialist Party, as quiet as it's kept, as threatening as that might seem to some people. People want comfortable ways out of this. I know it's the habit of human beings in general to always look for the easy solution. Nobody looks for a hard solution to a problem. You go to the easy solution first, and so there's Obama and there's Kamala, and it seems that you know, pretty soon we ought to get used to the okie dokie and recognize that we're gonna have to fight for this one, and we're gonna have to do some hard work, and shouldn't be afraid of work. As hard as we work for white people and white power, we can throw our resources and our energy into our own struggle for liberation. That means building the African People's Socialist Party around the world. That means joining the African People's Socialist Party in Occupy Tanzania,
joining the African People's Socialist Party in Bermuda, joining the African People's Socialist Party in Uganda, joining the African People's Socialist Party in the Bahamas, joining the African People's Socialist Party in England and France, and the Netherlands and the various other places where we're stretched across this world, joining this party, and we can win the liberation of Africa as long as we stay tethered, hyphenated human beings, long as we are Black Brits and Afro-Swedes, and all of these other characterizations that block our relationship to each other and to our Africa, we will be enslaved. And Kamala Harris is not there to take us to freedom. She and Joe Biden are there to make sure that we stay on the plantation of oppression and exploitation. And people have said, well, you know, we know she's not going to help, but it's a good symbol for what? It's a symbol for what? And so we have to fight our way out of this. There's not going to be any easy way out, comrades, brothers and sisters. So, uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman. So we did have a couple more questions, but it's currently 9:51. I wanted to know if you had any closing statements before we go into announcements.
Well, I just want to say that I really appreciate this work that we're doing. It's really important work. And I hope that you continue to bring other people beyond the party, beyond the Uhuru movement into these studies. At this time, it's a critical piece of work. It's always been really important, but at the time where people are in motion and trying to, looking for solutions, it's more important than ever. As cadre, we have a responsibility, even as a small party, to lead masses of people. As you know, that's a reality that we, that's reflected in our work, our organizations, our committees, and things like that. So I just want to thank everybody for being here and share this. Study, read this document. I mean, study is good, you know. I mean, it's not the only thing. There's some people just say study, study, study. But we're saying we're not just studying to become consumers of information. Our objective is to see how this study takes us out of the circumstances we're in. It is to inform our practice. It is not just to understand the world, but to change the world. Uhuru.
Again, Chairman Omali Yeshitela, thank you so much for that profound study of African internationalism. That was just part one of what will be a three-part in this series. So, if you have, the ability to go ahead and study this document that we just read, but the study materials is something that you'll be able to use for all three parts. So I just, again, really want to salute that study. That was incredible. And because of time, we want everyone to know that if your question wasn't answered, one of our moderators will correspond with you and make sure that the chairman sees your question, which will be asked at the beginning of the questions portion next Sunday. This study was brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, Winning the War of Ideas. For revolutionary news and analysis, you can visit theburningsphere.com. For revolutionary radio, dynamic shows, and music by Africans all around the world, tune into Black Power 96.3 FM, broadcasting out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and accessible via the Black Power 96 app for Apple and Android, or online at blackpower96.org. The theory of African internationalism is a theory of practice. All the energy of the African People's Socialist Party is focused on the destruction of capitalism, colonialism. Africans of the world, go to our website, apspuhuru.org, and fill out our contact form. Order your copy of Chairman Omali Yeshitela's latest books, Vanguard, The Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, and An Uneasy Equilibrium, at burningspillmarketplace.com. And those were, both books actually feature Chapter 9 on the theory of African internationalism. On Sunday, August 30th, Uhuru Foods and Pies hosts Baking for Black Power Conference. Be a part of building an independent African economy and learn more about this conference by visiting uhurupies.org. On Tuesday, September 1st at 6 p.m., join Black Power Blueprint Director Tichara Masimba and Media Coordinator Nze Masimba in a discussion themed Alderman Muhammad and the LRA Get Out the Way, regarding the fight against the attempts by Ward 21 Alderman John Muhammad and the St. Louis Land Reutilization Authority to stop Black progress in St. Louis. The International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement President, Columbai Antoinette, will also be joining this discussion. Please like and follow the Black Power Blueprint on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram, and register for the webinar at tinyurl.com/getouttheway. Starting Sunday, September 13th, from 7 to 7:30 p.m. Eastern, Buy Black Power presents Africonomy Live on Instagram Live at Buy Black Power, where we will be featuring Buy Black Power members, their businesses, and what it means to buy Black Power. Our first guest is Siali Muyenda of All Power Promotions and Creations. The International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement invites you to their annual convention, Build the African Nation. 100 years later, it's still red, black, and green. Taking place September 11th through the 13th, NPDUM is calling on you to fight for Black Power and register for free at npdum2020.eventbrite.com. That's INPDUM2020.eventbrite.com. On November 6th through the 8th, the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations hosts its annual Black People's March on the White House. So if you were sick of what you just saw with this Democratic Party charade over the past weekend, you can join the Black People's March on the White House with the Black is Back Coalition, themed Black Power Matters, Down with Colonialism, Black Community Control of the Police. Plan to attend and register. This will be taking place in Washington, D.C. So go ahead and plan to attend and register today. Find more information at blackisbackcoalition.org. We are calling on people to follow the All African People's Development and Empowerment Project on Facebook or visit developmentforafrica.org for important information and helpful tips in regards to COVID-19. AppDep has recently launched an international telehealth program, a free resource for African people to get our COVID-19 related questions and concerns answered by licensed doctors and nurses through Project Black Ankh. You can make your free virtual appointment with one of their professional health providers by going to developmentforafrica.org/telehealth. Chairman Omali Yeshitela goes live every week with an address to the African nation at 3 p.m. Eastern from Chairman Omali Yeshitela's Facebook page and the Burning Spear TV YouTube page. So make sure to tune in. There's another instance of political education with our chairman. So again, that's 3 p.m. Eastern every Wednesday with an address to the African nation, dealing with topical events and other issues that we see happening in the world. And lastly, to keep up with our movement events, visit theburningspear.com's events page and subscribe to our mailing list. Thank you all for tuning in. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday Study. Uhuru.